In this video, I'm going to be comparing the M1 MacBook Pro against the M1 MacBook Air in terms of their thermal performance. Now, both of these products are the base model variants, so they have 8GB of RAM and a 256GB hard drive. And of course, the MacBook Pro has the extra GPU core, whereas the MacBook Air does not. It just has 7 cores. Apart from that, everything else is the exact same. And I have to say, guys, I wasn't super surprised by this test. I'll actually pop the results up on the screen now. And before we get into the video, I'll briefly discuss my findings. So I found, of course, the MacBook Pro performed better than the Air. On average, at full load, it stayed about 10 degrees cooler than the Air, and the external temperature was actually a lot cooler as well. So right up here where it gets really hot, that was always a consistent 5 to 6 degrees Celsius cooler than the MacBook Air. So that's obviously going to result in cooler overall temperatures and the ability for the M1 chip in the MacBook Pro to perform better because it's not going to be quite as hot. So if you guys don't end up watching until the end of the video, my recommendation will be to get the Pro if you think you're going to be doing a lot of editing and a lot of rendering and you're going to be really putting the CPU under load where it's going to be hot a lot of the time. If you're not doing that though, just save your money and get the Air because this thing performs very, very well, even without the fan. Okay guys, so we have the two machines here. Obviously this is the MacBook Pro and this is the MacBook Air. Now they are both the base models, so this is just the 256GB SSD, 8GB of RAM, and the Air is again base model, 256GB SSD, 8GB of RAM, and just the 7 GPU core option. Now, as you can see right off the bat, these two have been sitting here for about 30 minutes in an ambient temperature controlled environment. So I have the air conditioning on and it is exactly 24 degrees Celsius in the room. And we can see here they are both pretty much the exact same temperatures. So we have on the MacBook Pro, 30 degrees for the average internal temperature, 27 degrees for the CPU, and the MacBook Air 29 degrees internally and about 26 for the CPU. So again, pretty much exactly the same. Now in these tests, everything is going to be exactly the same. So same software version, same apps, same app versions, everything is exactly the same. It's literally just two machines that are different. So what we'll do for the first test is we'll do some rendering in Resolve. So we'll open up Resolve on both machines. And now for the Resolve test, it's going to be the exact same one as I did with the MacBook Air previously. So we're going to have some 8K raw footage shot on a Red camera. Now the timeline is going to be in 4K and it's also going to be rendering in 4K. There's some LUTs applied, a little bit of very basic fusion, but apart from that, everything is pretty standard. And again, these two timelines are literally the exact same. So as we can see here, guys, if we go to the render page, we can see that they're both set up exactly the same. So they're both rendering in QuickTime format under the Apple ProRes codec. Everything else is exactly the same. So let's add these two to the render queue. All right, so we're going to render these at the same time, and we're going to be testing A, the temperature, and B, how long it takes each device to render this footage. Now this isn't really a fair comparison because obviously the Pro has an additional GPU core, so we're not really looking at time to render, it's more so the thermals during the render. Okay, so as we can see there, they've both started the render at the exact same time, and we'll look at the thermals. So you can see the Air definitely starts to get a little bit hotter initially, but now the MacBook Pro is turning on. The main fan is still off, as you can see here. Main fan 0 RPM. And the Air's definitely starting to get hotter much quicker. Now the MacBook is starting to heat up. You can see the MacBook Pro get to about 65 degrees. Now it's close to 70 degrees Celsius. And the MacBook Air is close to throttling temperatures. So as I said before in the previous video, guys, it throttles around 93 degrees Celsius. And we are pretty much almost there on the Air. We are at 91 degrees. Now you can see the fan on the Pro has just kicked in. We're at 1200 RPM. CPU about 78 degrees. You can also see we are just beating the Air in the render. It's already at 6% while the Air is only at 5%. And the main fan on the MacBook Pro is staying around 1200 RPM. And it's not very loud at all. I will do some decibel testing later on, but as of right now, I actually can't hear the fan at all. It's very, very silent. So what I'll do is I'll leave them for a few minutes and I'll cut to about 5 minutes in the future. Okay guys, so it's about 5 minutes later, and as you can see here, the fan on the MacBook Pro is now up to 2,400 RPM. Still very, very silent. I can barely hear it at all over the studio lights. And you can also see the MacBook Air is now fully thermal throttled. So it's at 94 degrees Celsius for the CPU, 73 degrees for the internal temperature. And just right off the bat, guys, you can see the MacBook Pro is a lot cooler. So it's about 10 degrees cooler across the board, both the CPU and the average temperature. So what we'll do now is we're actually just going to leave it for like half an hour, and we'll come back towards the end of the render and we'll see where we're at. Okay guys, so it's been some time, and as you can see, the Mac Pro is almost 90% through the render, and you can definitely start to see a difference between the two because the MacBook Air is only 66% through the exact same render. So obviously the fan in the MacBook is having a big difference because apart from that, everything is exact same. Of course, obviously this does have an extra GPU core, and if you guys are wondering why I'm not testing the 8 GPU core against the 8-core MacBook Pro, it's because A, I don't have an 8-core Air, and B, you shouldn't buy an 8-core Air. If you're gonna do that, spend the money and get the Pro instead. There's no point getting an 8-core Air, guys. Now, in terms of the fan is interesting. So it turns on and off. What seems to happen is the CPU temperature will get up towards 90 degrees. The fan will kick in. It becomes somewhat audible around 3,000 RPM, gets up to about 4,000 RPM. After about 10 to 15 seconds, it starts to drop as the temps drop, and then after a few minutes, it'll start back up again. So this seems to be very cyclical in nature, so it'll go hot and then cooler, fan will kick on, turn off. Whereas the MacBook Air, as you can see, literally just goes straight to 93 degrees on the CPU, stays there until the render is completed. So there's a lot more variability in the Pro. Now, if we do a quick thermal test with the thermal camera, you can see we're getting around 40 degrees Celsius on the MacBook Pro on the exterior. And on the hottest parts, we're getting about the same. There's not a huge level of difference there. Maybe a couple degrees hotter in the middle of the keyboard. And then on the Air, it is, again, it is much hotter than the MacBook by about 5 degrees Celsius on the exterior. So we're getting up to about 47 in some parts, and then almost 50 degrees on the keyboard, which again isn't a huge issue. That's not exactly super hot, and especially because it's not actually going to go above those temperatures. It will stabilize around that particular temperature, as we saw in the thermal test on the MacBook Air. So as you can see, guys, the MacBook Pro has finished the render. And as I said in the last video, as soon as the CPU is done with its intensive work, it drops straight back to base temperature. So you can see the temperature going straight back. That'll be back at about 30 degrees in a minute or two. And you can see that finished in 21 minutes and 43 seconds, whereas the MacBook Air is still going only at 77%. Okay, so now that the Air has finished the render, we can see there is a clear winner here. The MacBook Pro with 21 minutes and 43 seconds, and the Air with 29 minutes and 15 seconds. So that's roughly 30% increase in performance between the two models, and it kind of makes perfect sense actually, because the MacBook Pro is around 30% more expensive than the Air. Now obviously that's a combination of the fan and the extra GPU core, but still a very respectable performance from the base model MacBook Air. So let's move on to the next test. Okay guys, so as you can see, we have Shadow of the Tomb Raider loaded up on both machines. And if I go into the settings here, I know it's a little bit small because we're in windowed mode. You guys can see that the display and graphics are all the exact same settings. So if we go to display, we're at 1440 by 900. Everything else is switched off. And if we go to the graphical settings, everything is on low and turned off as per usual. So let's give it a good half an hour of some gaming, and we'll come back and we'll check out the temps. Okay guys, so it's been a good half an hour now, and I was actually testing this yesterday but I wanted to test again today just to make sure there was no difference, and there wasn't. So what we'll do first of all, before we get into the actual CPU temperatures and also the internal temperature, let's do a thermal analysis of the exterior of the Macs. So right now we're doing the MacBook Pro, and we're getting around, again, 40 degrees Celsius up the top, and then on the keyboard, which is usually the hottest part, getting around 41 to 43 degrees. Switching to the MacBook Air, we're getting, again, about 5 or 6 degrees hotter on average, and also above the keys, we're getting about, 46, 47 degrees. So running a little bit cooler than the render. So what we'll also do is we'll just touch the top of these Macs just with a finger, just to compare. So that's definitely not too warm at all. Moving on to the Air, you can tell straight away it's definitely hotter, but still, like, I can rest my hands on here. It's not super uncomfortable, whereas the MacBook is actually quite comfortable. It's not too warm at all. Now, if we also do a lap test, we'll test out the heat underneath. MacBook Pro, definitely a bit toasty. Yeah, you wouldn't want to have that in your lap unless you had something over it. And then the Air, yeah, about the same on the Air, so you probably wouldn't want to have these in your lap while gaming. Okay, so if we now minimize these two games so we can see the thermals, you can see the MacBook Pro is around 77 degrees Celsius, and the Air is right up around 91, 92 degrees Celsius, and then the average internal temperature on the Mac around 65, 66 degrees, and on the MacBook Air, about 74 degrees. So, and right now with gaming, actually, I think there's actually slightly a bigger margin than there was with the rendering. During the render, there was only about an 8 or 9 degree difference. Right now, it's about a 12 or 13 degree difference. So definitely a lot cooler while gaming for the MacBook, but the Air is still performing very respectably. Now, this particular Blender scene is relatively resource intensive, specifically on the CPU. So the laptop is definitely going to get quite hot during this test. You can see that just sitting on the Blender screen, idle, not doing anything, they're both around the exact same. The MacBook Air, tiny little bit hotter. The MacBook Air just seems to run about a degree, maybe 2 degrees warmer than the Pro. Probably just because of the way it's been designed, the heatsink. So now we'll render out an animation on both of these machines, and we'll bring up the temperatures first of all, so you guys can see how quickly it heats up. So straight away, the Pro up to about 40 or 50 degrees Celsius. The MacBook Air up to about 65. Again, the MacBook Air just shoots up to its max temp very, very quickly, whereas the Pro takes a little bit longer to heat up. You can see the main fan is not yet spinning. And as you can see there, the Air is getting very close to where it generally thermal throttles, around 93 degrees. And the Pro is still sitting at a comfortable 70 degrees. It is rising, but not by a huge margin. So what we'll also do as well is we'll bring up Activity Monitor. Now, I did this in the previous video, and it was interesting to see just how much of the CPU and the RAM that Blender took up while it was rendering. So you can see here the CPU is almost entirely utilized. There's only 0.38% available. There's a slightly higher amount of idle CPU usage on the Air, but again, that's just standard deviation. It will slightly change. And if we come into the memory tab, we can see they're both maxing out RAM. They're both using, well, this one's using a little bit more swap, but again, it's going to be hard to get them exact. And if I bring up a visual representation of the core usage, you can see there the CPU cores on both machines are fully utilized. So there's no issues there at all. Now going back to temperature, you can actually see that, again, this is very similar to the Resolve render we did previously. The MacBook Air will get up to 93 degrees, throttle almost instantly, and the MacBook Pro, the fans are now on at 2,500 RPMs. Can't hear it, it's completely silent, and it is keeping the CPU quite cool. So let's leave this for a good half hour or so. We'll come back and we'll take a temperature reading. So it's been about half an hour now, and as you can see, it's pretty much the exact same results as the Resolve render test. You have the MacBook Pro about 10 degrees cooler than the Air. So 86 degrees Celsius for the CPU, 65 for the internal. And over here with the Air, 93 degrees CPU and 73 for the internal. And if we do a quick thermal camera on the Mac Pro, at the hottest part, it's 41 degrees Celsius. And then on the keyboard, it is a little bit hotter. So it's about 40 as well. And then on the Air, going to be about 6 to 7 degrees hotter. So we've got 47 degrees. And then on the keyboard, we have 47 to 48 degrees. So again, guys, pretty much exactly the same as the Resolve render test. So I won't spend too much in this section, and we'll move on to the next test. Lastly, we have the multitasking test while also outputting to a 4K display. And guys, once again, absolutely no issues here. It's performing pretty much just as well as the Air did, probably even better. You can see here the temperature is 32 degrees, the CPU, and 34 for the internals. And you can see I've got quite a few things open. So I've got quite a few videos playing in Chrome. Also got quite a few Reddit tabs as well, some photos and images loaded, some online shopping, some Wikipedia, some news articles, some more news articles. So I've got at least 20 plus tabs in Chrome. I've also got some large PDFs. This one's about 40 megabytes in size, so similar to what a university student would be using. I've got Steam in the background. I've also got Activity Monitor running. I have 3 or 4 Excel spreadsheets open. All of them are about 40 megabytes in size. A few PowerPoints, and obviously the temperature program in the background. And you can see when I'm using Chrome, if I just open up Chrome again, the temperature will spike up to about 45 to 50 degrees. But there's no fan, there's no spinning fans, anything like that, no noise. It's very, very quiet and absolutely no issues. And again, this is outputting to a 4K monitor, and the Thunderbolt 3 cable is not warm at all. Neither is this part. So this part's a little bit warm, but you can barely tell that it's on. It's almost room temperature. So very, very good performance once again. If you want to see an exact comparison with the Air, watch the previous video that I did on the Air thermals. That will show you. But in terms of this video, they both performed almost exactly the same, so I didn't feel the need to put both in this video. So that's it for this video, guys. Hope you found it interesting. I did all of the findings, conclusions, and recommendations at the start of the video, so I don't need to repeat it again, but very, very impressed with the thermal performance of both machines. You're going to have absolutely no issues. The only situations in which the MacBook Pro pulls ahead and it's advantageous to have a fan is during heavy rendering where the CPU and the GPU is under a lot of load, but that is pretty much it. So if you're not doing that often, save your money, get a Air. Anyway guys, thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.